So this is almost all on Alex. Griffin and Athena, our new baby, they're doing some cool stuff, but this is a more coherent talk because it starts at the beginning and ends at the very end. So that's why you're going to hear about Alex today. Okay, so these are all the people that I have to say thank you to, particularly that small army of undergraduate assistants over 30 years. And so when I first began this work in the 70s, most people to examine the cognitive and communicative abilities of animals were using creatures with a close phylogenetic relationship to humans, such as the great apes, or animals with a large brain, such as the dolphins. And when I put in my first grant proposal saying I wanted to do this work with a parrot, a creature with a brain the size of a shelled walnut, 280 million years separation from humans on the evolutionary scale, I mean, the reviews literally came back asking me what I was smoking. And I kid you not, okay. But, and they had good reasons to be very, questioning this, because in the 40s and 50s, Maurer, who was at Harvard at the time, tried to do this kind of work with a bunch of memetic birds. How many of you have had Psych 101? Just so I know. Okay, pretty much all of you. Okay, so you'll know what I'm saying here. So basically, you give they did this on the standard, conditioning, operant conditioning type behavior. You show the animal a stimulus, and I'll get my little thing here. You show the animal a stimulus. You've got the brain, which you don't think about. It's some kind of black box you don't care about. And you wait for a response. And if it's the response you want, you give the animal a food reward that doesn't relate anything to what you're training about. The animal really wants its food because it's been starved down to 80% of its normal body weight. And again, think about how you feel when you miss lunch, much less being at 80% of your body weight. So food is like a big reinforcer here. And it had nothing to do with the training. So the idea was like to say hello when Maurer walked into the room. So the bird, he thought it meant hello when you walked into the room. For the bird, it meant feed me. So the bird would say this all day, every day. And of course, it was extinguished because he didn't get rewarded. The bird didn't get rewarded because it was only said when Maurer was walking into the room. So using those kind of techniques, it wasn't surprising that these birds learned almost nothing. And Grosslight and Zahner, a few years later, decided, well, Maurer might not have been rigorous enough because his birds weren't in the little sound isolation boxes. So that's what Grosslight and Zahner did. They worked with a bunch of minor birds. They put them in these boxes. They played them tapes of human speech, no social interaction whatsoever. The birds learned to reproduce the sounds of doors opening and closing in the lab or water dripping from the faucets and things, but didn't learn anything on the tape. Yet everybody knew that all these birds were memetic, and every pet owner said, my bird says blah, blah, blah. So the idea that these birds were, mindless mimics, they didn't understand what they were saying, they could just repeat like a tape recorder of some sort. So fast forward to 1975. Dietmar Todt was an assistant professor in the lab of Otto Köhler in Europe. We're going to hear a lot more about Köhler in a few minutes. And his assignment, because in Europe, if you're an assistant professor, it's more like you work for the full professor. And his assignment was to teach gray parrots to talk German. Well, his background was in bird song, little brown jobbies out in the forest. And he figured, okay, how do they learn? They listen to, Dad chattering with the other birds back and forth. So obviously Dad is some kind of model, okay? And the other birds are rivals for Dad's attention for the baby. So we're going to try to do this model rival technique and see if that will work teaching these birds German. The idea was to take what he saw as a valid ethological system and transfer it into the lab. So it's, the big thing about this is that the brain is no longer a black box, but it's a social information processor. And this is really important, and this is what we've done to train our birds. We've adapted Maurer's technique somewhat, but the basic idea is the same. We start and we use only referential rewards. So we start with some object that the bird really, really wants, okay, that he likes to play with. Let's say it's a piece of wood that he likes to chew on. So the bird is on a perch. I have the piece of wood. My student, who is the model for the bird's behavior and its rival for the bird's attention, I show the student, I say, what's this? And she goes, wood. And I go, that's right, it's wood. And I give it to her. She goes, wood, wood. And she starts to break it apart and be all excited about it. The bird's practically falling off the perch because, he wants it. We then exchange roles of model, rival, and trainer. So the bird sees that one person is not always the questioner and the other one the respondent, but that it's an interactive process. She shows it to me, but instead of doing it correctly, I'll go, and she'll turn away from me and she'll say, no, wrong. So the bird sees that not any weird noise causes transfer of the object. I then give it to her again, and we go back and forth several times. Now, if you all know something about parrot anatomy, you probably don't know very much about how they produce their vocalizations. It starts in the syrinx. They have to alter their trachea, which gives them the first format of speech. They can only change that 10%. Most of the change goes in the larynx and the glottis, the beak opening and closing, the tongue going back and forth and up and down. It's like you say ah versus e, and you can feel all those differences. They have to learn how to move all those muscles for each of our sounds. This is not natural to them. So what will happen is the first time we ask the bird, it's not going to say would. I mean, imagine even going whoop without lips, okay? What they're going to do is go whoop, okay? Well, but that's a solid sound. So we reward that initially, and then we work it out until they can, we make them go better and better as the time goes on. So right now, Athena likes nylon toys, and she's going ion. Okay, that's the best she can do at this point, but we know it's going to come down the road because we are shaping her up. So using these techniques, Alex, over the 30 years I worked with him, learned to identify about 50 different objects, 7 shapes, 7 colors. He learned to identify numbers up to 8. That's the whole purpose of this talk today, explain that work. He understood categories and labels for categories. So you could show him something and say what color, and he'd say blue, what shape, 4 corner, what matter, wood, what object, toy. Okay, what toy, and he'd say like a block, something like that, or what object or what toy, and he'd say block. He understood to use these labels in the way of understanding similarity and difference. So you could pull anything out of your pockets and ask what's same and what's different. And even if he had never seen them before, he could tell you color, shape, matter for material, or none if nothing was same or different, if they were identical or completely different. He understood concepts of bigger and smaller. So again, you could take anything out and show him what's color bigger, what color smaller, what matter bigger, what matter smaller. Without any training whatsoever, he transferred none from the same difference study into the size study. So that was an important aspect of transfer. Use of none, and that's also going to be important for later part of the talk. So because he understood this concept of absence of information. He understood joint attention. This is something very important when you're working with young children. People don't think about it, but the way young children mostly learn their words is by jointly attending to objects with their caretakers. So if you're sitting on the floor with a child and they're playing with a little truck and you're going, truck, it's your red truck, that child's going to learn the label truck. If the child is playing with a truck and you have your back to the child and you're mumbling about the truck, child sees no reason why that background mumbling has anything to do what she or he is playing with, doesn't learn the label. This is work by Dare Baldwin and Mike Tomasello and a bunch of others. We found out the same is true with our birds. They need us jointly attending to the object if they're going to learn the label for it. They have recursion, not in the linguistic sense, which is this is the cat that bit the rat that ate the cheese that lived in the house that Jack built. It's kind of embedded phrases. But they do have recursion and conjunction in a more mathematical sense. So you could give them a tray of junk and say, what object is green and 3 corners? Or what color is 3 corners in wood? And that they have to recursively go through those sentences to figure out what you are targeting and what answer they should give. As I mentioned, there's transfer from one topic to another. Alex had a lot of labels for places as well, and so he could use phrases like I want X or want to go Y to tell us where he wanted to go or what he wanted to eat. These were intentional. If he asked you for a banana and you tried to feed him a grape, he'd toss it at you and you'd be wearing it. And there was fast mapping of a sort, again, a little bit different from what children do, but he would play with his vocalizations. So he saw himself in the mirror, he asked what color. He would also ask us questions to get information. So he asked what color, we said gray, and then he started playing with gray, so it was gray, grape, grain, chain. If we gave him objects that would fit into those categories, they would become, and he liked them, they would become mapped immediately. Other things he would play with, so he came up with binary for a banana. That was solid. But banacker, we gave him a dried banana chip, banana cracker. He hated them. They never were in the repertoire. But we could use this as a way to expand his repertoire. Okay, so these are just a few little clips so you can hear him.
What corn? What wheat?
Little bits of shredded wheat.
What color?
All right, so we were doing a lot of work with him just before he passed. Numerical competence, optical illusions. He actually sees certain optical illusions the way we do, so does Griffin. That's another paper we've just submitted. And the creation of labels from bits of sound. So that's sort of what I was talking about before, but we did it in a more complicated manner. But today's numerical competence. So a little numerical history. All right, so Otto Köhler, the fellow I mentioned before, professor I forget the town, but it's in Germany. He was studying numerical competence in a bunch of different birds, in corvids and parrots. And this is a picture from his lab, and from the 40s and 50s that he was working on this. And essentially what the bird would do, he'd see these blobs here, and then he'd have to go over and touch the card with the same number of blobs. Now you can see that these are in a different pattern, it's different contour, it's different mass. He's controlled for all the other variables. The only thing that's the same is the number. This was very important. In fact, people doing work with children didn't have all these controls for many years. And it was a big brouhaha when they were trying to convince us to follow their techniques. And we're going, no, 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 our techniques are better. And then he did a more complicated task, which I couldn't find a picture. Remember, this is from the 40s and 50s. A lot of his stuff was destroyed during the war. But this was a more complicated task. So the bird had all these little boxes out there, and each box had a piece of paper on the box with a different set of blobs of stuff on it. And he changed the paper for each setting so the bird couldn't get a particular pattern. He changed the density, all these contours and things, each test, and he rearranged the numbers for each trial. And then he'd show the bird, he'd break off some blobs of clay and throw it near the bird. So the bird had to go over and walk over and open the box with the same number of blobs of paint as blobs of clay to get its reward. So Köhler called this thinking in unnamed numbers and non-numerical counting, because it's not likely the bird was going, 1, 2, 3, 4, but it was doing a very sophisticated match to sample based on number. The idea of knowing that there was a one-to-one correspondence between one set of blobs and another. An important thing about this is he tested a lot of different animals, and chickens bottomed out at 2 to 3, although I have to say my colleague Giorgio Valentigiera in Italy has been doing some interesting things where it's not counting, but it is some kind of a recognition in chickens up to about 5. Okay, but it's not counting. Pigeons bottomed out at about 4 to 5, and gray parrots and jackdaws could do 7 to 8, depending on the task. So it was quite a big difference in these birds. And there was a lot of concurrent work with humans as well on something called subitizing. And that is a fast perceptual mechanism where I don't give you enough time to count, but it's something like this. And then I ask you how many. Now you could easily do the small numbers, but when we get to the bigger numbers, you actually bottom out at the same level as the pigeons on accuracy, okay? Because if you can't, I don't give you the time to count. Now every once in a while there's a biologist in the thing who's very good about geese flying overhead real quick, and he would know immediately, he or she would know immediately. But they've been trained to do this. You are trained in this in terms of things like dice and dominoes. Okay, those are called canonical patterns. So essentially, if I flashed not these silly balls and things in front of you, but dice or dominoes, I could do it for milliseconds, and you would get it because you've got that pattern recognition. Okay, but of course, what Köhler did was he avoided them having that pattern recognition. So also, Lurgler and Braun in his lab at that time transferred it from these visual simultaneous to visual sequential by using flashes of light, and from auditory and sequential using notes on a flute. And the birds, the jackdaws and the gray parrots got up to about 7 or 8 on those trials. So it was cross-modal, it was pretty sophisticated. In the States, in the 80s, David Premack was working with a chimpanzee, Sarah, who was trained to use little plastic chips for words. So a green plastic triangle, for example, was a banana, and a blue plastic square was an apple or something like that, okay? And he was trying to train her using Arabic numerals. And he found she could do something on the order of matching, a 3 to 3 blobs of something. But she was much faster and much more accurate on match to sample of 3 crackers to 3 pieces of apple than to matching them to the Arabic number. Geschwind, looking at humans, found that there were different parts of the brain that were actually involved in match to sample versus labeling of numbers. Okay? So for me, the big question was, what about this parrot with vocal labels? And what was particularly intriguing to me was that Alex already had labels for 2 shapes. He could label a triangle as 3-cornered, okay, which is triangle. And so we decided to use 4-corner for a square. Was it just a perceptual thing that this object was this random thing? Or could we transfer this into a numerical thing of sort of counting corners? All right. So we did this with him. We trained him on a small subset of items in the laboratory, and then we tested him on all the other different things in the laboratory. And this is an old data slide. It doesn't have 1 on it because it turns out 1 was the hardest number for him to learn. Okay, 3 and 4, he already had the label, so it was a matter of mapping the labels 3 and 4 to sets of objects. Then we taught him 5 and 2, and then we taught him 6 and 1. And this is, again, important for the later part of the talk, but 1 was tough because he already knew to call this thing a key. So why should he call it 1 key? I mean, he did learn it, but it was really tough. So this is a confusion matrix, and you're going to say, yeah, that's for sure, but it's really not that complicated. So these are the objects presented to the bird. So it's paper, key, wood, pegwood, cork, and these are the numbers of these objects, and this is what he said. So the correct response lies on the diagonal. All right, so you can see that he's made almost all the correct responses on these sets. The far thing that with a U on it, that's something unintelligible. So if he said something like green key, and we couldn't tell if it was green key or 3 key, that was if we couldn't understand it, I'd have my back to him. Student would ask him and say how many. If it was something like green key, I'd say I don't understand it and count it as an error. He also had what we called these generic errors, which were really interesting. You'd say, how many? And he'd say key. And you go, well, Alex, we know, that's fine. A key is a key is a key, but how many key? So we had to count that as an error because I'd asked how many, and he'd only given me the label. So if you count all those things as errors, he was right only about 75–80% of the time. But you can see that most of these errors were things like that, or calling a pegwood, which was a clothespin, wood, and things like that. So he really was quite accurate on identifying these things. We didn't give him a time limit. We just let him sit there as long as he wanted. So he'd sit there. Sometimes he'd preen. We'd have to ask him several times to get his attention. But, he got this. He understood his numbers. But we didn't know if he was counting or if it was some kind of perceptual mechanism. I mean, even though we threw things on the tray as randomly as we could, and we'd give him things that at the time he couldn't label, like these woolen pom-poms, I mean, for 1 to 3 things, there isn't many different ways you can throw things on a tray. So we didn't know if it was some kind of perceptual mechanism or counting at this point. But he was very accurate. And he was equally accurate on these new things. And he was equally accurate if you gave him a set like this and you said how many key, how many cork, or how many toy. And this was really important because if you ask young children about 4 years old, 3.5, 4 years old they just want to tell you the total number. They won't tell you about the subsets. So this was, kind of a first cool thing we had that differed from kids, although we didn't know when we got it because we published this in '87 and the kid paper didn't come out till later. So this was another interesting study in the sense that I was at a Psychonomic Society meeting, and Trick and Pyletion were talking about human perception, and they said if you give humans a tray like this, and it wasn't exactly this was our interpretation of the task, but if you give humans a tray like this, and you ask them how many, red wool, they can't use that subitizing mechanism. They have to count because they can't do what was called a perceptual pop-up. Okay, you could pop up all the red things and you could pop up all the blue things, but you can't, and you can maybe pop up all the wood things and maybe pop up all the wool things, but you can't pop up the conjunction. Okay, and when you can't pop them up, you have to count to get it right. And through different types of studies, they found that humans were counting when you asked them to do this type, like how many red wool, even when you're talking about one of them, because they had to do this sequential search, and they were literally counting. So we figured, hey, Alex could do the simpler task. What would happen if we gave him this task? No training whatsoever. We just started throwing this at him to see what happened. And the answer is he did pretty well. I mean, he wasn't 100% accurate, but he did pretty well. Again, the correct responses are all on the diagonal. He did like to say the word for, and that was, again, one of his earlier labels. But if he were doing the perceptual thing, like I was telling you about, the subitizing, he'd be making a lot of errors at the larger numbers, like you did. I mean, he would make more errors, and the errors would be more serious down here at 5 and 6. And he didn't. I mean, he just basically made some random errors around the way. So this suggested he was counting, but we still couldn't prove he was counting. But if an ape had done this, people would argue that it would have been counting. Believe me, they were doing it. Okay, so this is a little video of him doing that task. And before I show it, I want to talk about it for just a moment. This was done while we were at the Media Lab, and it was because one group wanted to see that we're taping us. Well, you know, what if you just give him this tray, when, you know, with these things all the time when people are filming, and he knows to say 4 every time he sees the tray. So they insisted that we ask him multiple times. Now, in our lab, we only ask him multiple times on a particular task if he's wrong. We mix up all the different trials and different topics because we don't want him to get bored. We don't want him to say, oh, it's a number task today. I don't have to think about anything or say anything about numbers. So we mix up all the tasks. So here I'm asking him 3 questions on the same tray, and he's quite confused about this, and he's getting frustrated. So the first one he'll answer correctly. Then he starts shaking his head, and I came, come on, do this. And then the third one, he actually repeats the answer to the second question because but I'm right, aren't I? You know, and I have to ask it again. So you'll see this kind of behavior, which in and of itself is also interesting. Takes a second.
How many green block? On the tray, how many orange wool? How many orange wool?
3.
Very good boy. Okay, we'll get you that nut.
He can ask for whatever he wants as a reward.
There you go. Can you tell me how many orange block? How many orange block? How many orange block? How many orange block? Very good. Okay, last question. How many green block? How many green block?
It's getting really annoying.
Good boy. How many green block? Yeah, how many green block? How many green block? Good boy. How many green block? Now, how many green block?
4.
Good boy. Good parrot. Okay.
Okay, so we had production, but what about comprehension? And you think, well, if he can produce the labels, of course he comprehends them. Not so fast. Karen Wynn did a study with, again, 3.5, 4-year-old children, and she'd give them, you know, some marbles on a tray, and she'd say, how many marbles? And they'd go, 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 marbles. And you think the child knows 4. Then she gave the child a big bowl of marbles and said, give me 4. And the kid literally would take a handful and go, here. So the kid didn't comprehend the meaning of 4-ness. The child had a one-to-one correspondence of their learned, you know, pattern of saying, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but they didn't really understand it. And this is really important. So we had to test this. So this was, we did a variation on the other task. Now the task was, you know, what color 6? And this was the only set of objects that was the same size, because we couldn't get blocks in different sizes. Usually it was different size, so we were controlling for mass and contour and all those other good things. The other important thing is the look. Okay, right after this picture was taken, he took his beak and he threw everything on the floor, which is what was going on here. So what happened was we got through, and you'll see the next slide, we got through the first dozen or so trials absolutely, I mean, you know, 95% correct. He was right on target. And then he started messing around. And the way he was, and you can see, he's overall pretty good. He started messing around. How did he mess around? He'd sit there and he'd throw everything on the floor. Or he'd turn his back to us and start preening. Or he'd give us all the wrong colors. So on this slide you can see, so we'd say, what color, you know, 6? And he'd say orange, gray, purple, yellow, okay? So you knew he wasn't just goofing up on the numbers. He was just, and the reason was these were all boring objects. So remember, the objects are his first reward. He can ask for anything else. He was just so bored out of this task. And this task was given 15 years after the other task. So he'd been doing numbers for 20 years at this point. He was not interested in this thing at all. But we got the first set of trials, and then I come in, and I mean, we started using things like jelly beans to get him interested in the stuff, and I mean, all things you really shouldn't be feeding them, but just to get through this stuff, we needed 60 trials. And then I come in one day, and there's 3, 4, and 6 things on the trial. I go, Alex, what color 3? And he goes, 5. No, Alex, what color 3? 5. And we're going back and forth several times, and I'm going, there's no 5 things on the tray, what's going on here? But he's not throwing things, he's not ignoring me. I mean, he's interacting with me. He's not giving me wrong colors. So I finally look at him and I say, okay, Smarty, what color 5? And he looks at me and goes, none. And that was he was 26 at this point. That was the first time I looked at him like, you just said what? Because what he had done was he had transferred the concept of absence, a zero-like concept, to number, okay? I mean, we in the Western world didn't have a zero-like concept until the 1600s, all right? A place marker for 0 till the 1600s. They had it in the Asian countries, but not here. I mean, hello. And he had figured out how to manipulate me into asking the question he wanted to answer, which was a whole nother level of complication. So so we were really excited about this. We asked him several other times in the course of the study, and he said none appropriately when there was no set of things on the tray. One time he gave us a color that wasn't on the tray. But, we figured this, and so we were pretty excited about it. But we called it a zero-like concept because we didn't know if it was the same 0 as you and I had. We were also doing sequential sounds with Griffin at this point. So it would be the equivalent of listen, how many? We did it with a computer with appropriate click intervals and changing the length of the clicks and stuff, so we were controlling for all the things you're supposed to control for. But that was basically the task. So Griffin had his little beak in the air that day and didn't want to work. So I come in, and the students are telling me he's blah, blah, blah. And I say, all right, come on, Griffs, listen. How many? Nothing. All right, Griffin, come on, listen. How many? So Alex, who was interrupted all of Griffin's sessions, all the time, telling him to talk clearly and say better and just really bullying him, would, piped in and said 4. And I looked, I said, you be quiet, not clicking 4 times. So listen, Griffin, listen, how many? And Alex now says 6. And I realize he's counting the clicks. So actually doing an auditory counting task is really not something you want to try to do in terms of controls and stuff. It's a major headache. But Boyson and Bernson were working with apes, and they were doing addition by having the apes walk around the room and open up boxes with different numbers of apples in it. So Sarah would walk down, or Sheba would walk into one room, open up a box, and there'd be 1 apple, and then walk down the other box with 2 apples. And then she'd walk over to a number board and point to 3. So we figured we could adapt this for Alex. And this was a task. So we would hide nuts or crackers or bits of stuff under cups, and then we'd show him sequentially. And then when the cups were covered, we'd ask him, okay? So let me just show you. He says it very softly. But you'll see what we're doing.
Again.
So look. How
many nuts total? 3. That's right.
Okay. But he could do this, okay, without seeing what was under anything. So he had to remember what was under each of the cups and sum them. He eventually did it with 3 separate cups, and he eventually started doing it with Arabic numbers. The next study that I'll talk about, we trained him to actually identify Arabic numerals, and he could sum the Arabic numerals under the cups. Okay, so this was the data on the addition. It was really, quite nice. The only problem was over here, and these are only first trials. We ask him several times to see what's going on, if he's just blowing us off or if there's some other thing going on. So we do ask him if he's wrong to find out what happens. But we only report the first trials as our data for getting how much he understands the task. So the problem was if there was 5 and 0 under the cups, he always said 6. Now he knew 5. He had known 5 for 15 years. He could do 2 and 3. He could do 4 and 1. What was going on with 5 and 0? Okay, so I was really frustrated. This took a long walk, tried to figure it out, and I realized, you notice how quickly we popped the cups up and up, down. This was the first time we had ever given him a time-limited task. So think about it. You're a parrot. You know, I'm showing you, look, what's there? There's nothing under that cup. Look, what's there? There's a bunch of stuff under that cup. I'm not giving you enough time to count it. But you see lots. And if your subitizing level as a parrot is the same as my subitizing level as a human, my subitizing limit's 4. Remember, we were talking about that. For humans, it's 4. If I don't give you time to count, your accuracy falls apart at 4. So he saw lots, and he said, 6, that's my biggest number. So we then were halfway through the task, and we now gave him about 5 to 10 seconds for each cup, for all the cups, not just for the 5, because we didn't want it queuing. And bingo, he understood that there were 5. So this was our first evidence that he could count, because just like humans, if you time limited him, his mess-up point was 5, just like humans. And we also did the none. We put nothing under the cups, and we'd ask him how many. And 3 times he looked at us like, 5 times rather. He looked at us and he went, huh? I don't know what you're going through. And 3 times he said 1, which was interesting because it sounds a little like none, but the more important thing was it's at the low end of the number line. So it's as though he knows it's something small, but he doesn't know what to say. And another chimpanzee that did numbers, Matsuzawa's Ai, did the same thing when she was being taught 0. Now, Alex was never taught 0. He was just spontaneously giving us this small number. So this suggested to us that he was inferring his number line. Now, remember, he was never taught in order. He was taught 3 and 4, 5 and 2, 6 and 1. So somehow he'd infer, it seems like he was inferring this number line. So we wanted to, test this out. But the main thing about the none business, which was important, was that, all the other times, none referred to an absence of an attribute. Okay, here I'm asking it to comment on the total absence. And if you look at the child literature, that's what children do. They do the same thing he did. They either look at you like, huh? Or they will they'll mix up 1 and 0. And there's a whole literature on that, okay? So this is when children are first learning about 0. So to do the number line business, we had to train him on Arabic numerals, because I'll explain the task. It was pretty clever. So this was, we'd give him a tray like this, and to train him on the numerals, it was, what number blue, or what color 6, something like that. And so these were never connected to blobs of stuff. So we had to realize that whatever these number labels that he already knew that represented blobs of stuff, we were making him call these single squiggles by the same label. And the reason for that is we wanted to first figure out if he could understand the equivalence connection. So for example, that the label 6, we had production and comprehension of 6 blobs of something. We eventually had production and comprehension that it referred to this squiggle. But could he infer the relationship between the squiggle and the number? Okay, basically this is called Sidman equivalence. And the task had to be interesting because he had to be able to do it over and over without getting a pattern recognition so we could get enough data. And we wanted to see if he could infer the number line. So we had him label the color of the bigger or smaller numeral. So this was the task. And the reason it was bigger or smaller, because we didn't want him just to do bigger. We want him to really understand what was going on. All of the studies with the apes either did all biggers at first and then smallers. They never mixed them up, which is what we did. And they never had them actually do it with respect to labeling the color, so there could have been a pattern recognition. So we could do this over and over. Okay, so we did this. I analyzed the data twice because when I showed him a tray like this, and I'd say, what color number bigger on the tray before, sometimes he gave me the color, the number 5 instead of the color, which was right. I mean, it wasn't wrong. So we'd reward him, but we try to get him to say the color. So we cranked it out saying if he, counting the label of the number is wrong, he was right about 75% of the time. If we gave him an okay on that one, he's right about 80% of the time, 85% of the time. Okay, and the errors, sometimes he said none when he shouldn't, because we'd ask him like 2 2s and say what color number bigger, what color number smaller. So we want him to say none on that, and sometimes he said none inappropriately. There was sometimes, these birds see in the ultraviolet, as you probably know. We were using, instead of, normally we would dye things with a particular color, orange, because orange was a tough color for him. But we were using little refrigerator numbers that you get from kids, so the colors were a little bit weird, so sometimes they were a little too yellowy, and he would say yellow instead of orange. Sometimes it was the wrong choice, sometimes he would just mess around, but essentially he got it. There was no distance effect, so if I ask you what's bigger, 1 or 6, it's much easier than if I ask you between 4 and 5, okay? We didn't see any distance effect with him, and again, this wasn't accuracy. We did it with him with accuracy. With you, I would do it with speed. So it's not quite the same, all right, but that we saw no difference on this. We also size effect, so 2 is twice as big as 1. So again, it's easier to distinguish 1 versus 2 versus 5 and 6, because the ratio between 5 and 6 is quite close. We didn't see any issue there. Again, if I did it with you, I would do it on speed, not accuracy. But we couldn't do speed with him because, you know, he just didn't want to work sometimes, so we'd have to ask him several times over and over. Okay. And he didn't care if the larger was on the right and the left. Again, you're faster if I give you the smaller number on your left because you've got this internal number line. Okay. We gave him something like this, and we'd say, what color number bigger or what color number smaller? Initially, he gave us the answer based on the size of these things for the first 5 trials. But then after about halfway through the study, he went, oh, everything else is what these mean. Well, I'm going to shift, and I'm going to talk about the meaning. So in the last 7 trials, he replied none. He understood that we were looking at what these things meant and not just their size. We didn't get a chance to give him like a big 4 and a small 2, or rather a big 2 and a small 4 because he died before we could do the opposition. Okay. We also gave him sets like this, though, 1 squiggle and 3 blobs. All right? And he would understand that the 6 was bigger than the 3 blobs. The only time he messed this up was when we pitted the Arabic number against a single object, and then they both became objects to him, and he said none. So if we gave him a 6 versus 1 block, he'd say none, because then it became, he objectified the Arabic numeral. Okay, so he not only understood this equivalence, but he had inferred the ordinality of these numbers. That's the only way he could do this. And this is amazingly important because all the apes needed tons and tons of training to do this. And he inferred this on his own. So this was really important because this made him much more like a child. So this is about the time that I went to the Radcliffe Institute and started working with Susan Carey and Liz Spelke, who were doing number work with children. And we were trying to see, you know, how different was Alex from kids and how different was he from apes and how similar they might be. It turns out if you look at apes and kids and birds, they all learn their first numbers very slowly. And that was the same thing was true with Alex. So a child will learn their first number, you know, 1 versus many. They're about 2 years old, 2.5 years old when they're first learning 1 versus many. It takes them 9 more months to learn 1 versus 2 versus many. Another 5 months to learn 1 versus 2 versus 3 versus many. And they're usually about 4 years old before they get 1 versus 2 versus 3 versus 4 versus many. And at that point, and somewhere along the line, the child is also learning the number line that I mentioned before. So if you ask a 3-year-old to count, she or he will say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They, you know, it's like the alphabet where they think LMNOP is, you know, 1 letter. Okay, they don't really understand it, but they can do it. And they can do that 1-to-1 correspondence. So they could go 1, 2, 3, 4, and you think they know 4 when they don't. But about the time they hit 5, okay, they get it all. And they have integrated this number line with their labels and the objects, and you never teach a normal kid 5. Okay, they get it. They put this all together. It's they understand the sequence. They know that, you know, you never teach them 6. 6 is 1 more, whatever. Some kids get a little bit messed up with, you know, 13 and things like that instead of 13, but essentially they're getting it. Okay. So, but animals don't do this, okay? The children integrate all this information. Apes do not. It took Matsuzawa's eye and Boyson's chimp just as long to learn 7 and 8 as it did to take them 1 and 2. And the interesting thing is with Alex, he also learned his numbers slowly. But remember, we didn't do them in order. And with Alex, too, he had inferred this number line. But remember, when he has to learn a new label, it's not just pointing to the, Arabic number. It's learning how to say something like 6, okay, or 5 with a V, without lips. So maybe the issue with him was vocal learning and not mental understanding, all right? So what Sue and Liz and I came up with, and Liz eventually kind of decided she didn't want to be part of this because she had too many other things to do, but Susan Carey and I kept working on this. We decided to train him on the Arabic 7 and 8, again, in the absence of all stuff. He wouldn't even initially know that these were numbers because we were also training him to identify letters like, ch for CH and sh for SH and s for just an S and things like that. So now we're showing him these things. It was actually really tough because he started saying 7 as 1, which sounds stupid, but he then went to snun and couldn't do the V. Okay, so things 7, snun, okay, that made sense. But because he was using s for 6, we had to retrain that to 6 and get that final S there so we wouldn't be cueing him by waiting for another syllable for the 1 for 7. And that took 13 months because remember, he'd been using this noise, sick, for 15 years, and now all of a sudden we're telling him, no bud, no good anymore. So that took 13 months. The 8 was immediate because he had the word great for a nutmeg grater that he'd play with. So 8 came right away. He didn't understand what it meant right away, but he could say it. So then we taught him that 6 was less than 7 was less than 8, and the reverse by the tray. Okay, again, we put a 6 on the tray and an 8 on the tray. What color bigger, what color smaller? We modeled this for him. We trained him on this. Then we tested him on the whole number line to see if he understood where, say, 1 through 5 fit in with 7 and 8, okay? And he got it, all right? He did make numbers on orange. He sometimes gave us the number label instead of the color, okay? But without these errors, he was really correct, and he got this. So he understood. He had inferred where 7 and 8 fit. But what did 7 and 8 mean? If you think about it, in reality, it could mean 10 and 20. I mean, why, to you and me, 7 and 8 are the next thing on the number line, but why would he assume that? Unless he was like the kids, okay? But, he had no reason to assume that, per se. But remember, every time we had trained him, so he had 3 and 4, and then we did 1 more and 1 less. And 6 and 5, 1 more, 1 less. He couldn't go less. He was already at none, okay? So if he understood the game, he would understand that these were 1 more. And he did. The first time we showed him, okay, this was a critical issue. The first time we showed him these numbers of sets, would he understand that this set of blobs of things was 7 and the other set was 8? And he did. And again, he was never associated with anything, okay, on the tray, no number sets of things, all right? And the first time he saw them, he identified them correctly. If he saw 6 things and we added 2, he'd say 8. If we had 8 things, we took away 1, he said 7. He understood this. And this was the first trial. He then kind of messed up a little bit, as he always would do, because it got boring. We would give him a tray with, say, 5, 6, and 8 things on the tray and say, what color is 7? And if he didn't really understand what 7 was, he might give us the color for 6 and 8, but he'd say none, because he knew that 7 was missing, so we tested it and things like that. So we really knew that he understood what these labels were, okay? So he was much more like children than apes. This is the only animal so far that has been able to do this, all right? Matsuzawa has been working on this with his apes now for 3 years. If he had gotten it, it'd be published. It's not there, okay? So, we have, again, 280 million years separation. Evolutionarily, what's going on here, okay? Well, it turns out that some level of number concepts, per se, is in every critter we have looked at, okay? Maybe not aplasia, okay, but I mean fish and bees and all these other, 1 versus 2 versus 3. Any animal that forages for a living knows more versus less and does 1 versus 2 versus 3. There's something very simple about that. Once you get above that, you get what we call the approximate number system. So you can give a chicken and you can say, which is more, 8 or 16? And they'll go to the pot with 16. They can't count up to 16. They can't count up to 8. okay? But they understand more versus less. The issue is, okay, how do you get these animals to have exact number? Not this approximate number system, but exact. Monkeys will do approximate number system. They'll tell you that, you know, something is 7 with about a 60% accuracy. Okay, so they get it more than chance, but it's not great. But Alex would tell you this with 90% accuracy. Okay? And it turns out if you look at Matsuzawa's eye, Sally Boyson Shiba, and Alex, we've given them exact symbolic representation. And this seems to be really important to be able to do number work because there are tribes in Peru, the Pria. I don't know if you've read the studies on them. They have labels for very, very few, some, and many. And you try to get them to do any kind of counting, they cannot. They just have this approximate number system. They're hunter-gatherers. They don't need it. They don't collect anything. If they go hunting, they don't say, we need 5 hunters. They just say, Sam, Bob, Joe, you know, Bill, and me, and we're going to go out. Okay, they don't count. I'm sure you could take a Priya child, put the child in Head Start, and the child would learn numbers. I don't think there's anything missing in the neural system there, okay? But they don't have it in their system, and the adults will not learn. Okay, the adults, there must be some kind of sensitive period on this for learning. So the final slide here is to answer the question that is always the first question that people ask me after a talk is, okay, so why do these birds have these abilities? And this is a picture of gray parrots in Cameroon. They are in exactly the same spot that a lot of the great apes are in these areas, not so much in Cameroon, but in Democratic Republic of Congo and in other places like that. And in 1966, Allison Jolly, in 1975, Nick Humphrey wrote a paper saying, why are apes so smart? Well, they're in complex social and ecological environment. And these parrots have the same complex ecological environment. They forage 60 kilometers a day. Like the chimps, they are long-lived. And like the chimps, they are in complex social environments. This is a small flock of grays. There is probably, if they're anything like the laboratory, there's a hierarchy in the apes. If Sam beat up on Joe and Joe beat up on me, I don't go near Sam. I have to infer this thing called transitive inference so I can figure out, you know, who not to go fight with. We think there's the same kind of thing in the lab. There's certainly a pecking hierarchy. So this might be true in these groups. So they have to be able to do this. They have to remember this over their long lives. Because, you know, Sam is going to get old. He's going to die. And, you know, it might not even be Joe that takes over, but Billy and Bob could have an alliance and take over and stuff. So they've got to be smart, have the smarts to update all this information. The same within foraging. If you forage 60 kilometers a day, you got to know, you have to have a map of where this stuff is to do this efficiently and know where things are and how things change over your lifetime. So I think this is why we're getting the same type of abilities in these birds as we're getting in the apes and, you know, by extrapolation in young children. So I want to thank you so much for listening. I know we're just barely making it. Some of you have to run it at 1, but I'm happy to stay and answer a few questions for those of you who can stay. Thank you.